Hello and welcome. So let's talk about this idea of giftedness. If you're new here, you may be looking for a second opinion, or maybe you're just looking for more information on whether this is a way in which, a lens through which you should think and identify yourself. After all, maybe isn't it just ADHD, or maybe you suspect you have some traits of autism and you heard someone say that giftedness is only something that other autistics have. So the messy truth is that these are all distinct dimensions, but they can be highly overlapping dimensions. So somebody could have participate in all three of these dimensions. And that said, though, the overlapping is possible because these are fundamentally distinct. Just in the same way that someone might have blue eyes and red hair and be left-handed, but also colorblind. So you've probably already come across a lot of material on neurodivergence, and you've noticed that a lot of the discussion in neurodivergence actually revolves around ADHD or autism, and with many people just flat out equating neurodivergence with one or both of these dispositions. But in fact, it involves quite a bit more than that. And maybe after a lot of thought and reflection and research, you've noticed like one or two or maybe more of these traits within yourself. But you also know that overall, these labels just don't quite seem to fit. But at the same time, you know, because you can absolutely feel your own neurodivergence or neurocomplexity. And you know this because of the history of the kinds of interactions you've had with some other people. For example, some of the strange looks you got, or the fact that so many other people had different types of reactions than you to certain things happening. Or maybe you were singled out for a type of reaction or behavior that you had. Or you grew up just sort of accepting the label of highly sensitive, or this was used in a derogatory way, and maybe your parents would call you like overly sensitive or try to demolish you through calling you an overthinker, or just downplaying this and that, like, oh, don't worry about that, why are you thinking about this? Or my favorite, what's wrong with you? So the messy truth is that there are actually many factors that contribute to neurodivergence. It's not just autism or ADHD. And this is why more people have been calling for an upgrade, again, to this concept and to refer to this more in terms of neurocomplexity. And I've talked about this in some of my earlier videos, which I'll link up here below, and I've talked about this in some of my earlier videos, which I'll try to link one up here right now. But if I was to explain this, neurocomplexity can involve both a collection of more or less fixed traits or dispositions, and this is where like ADHD, autism, and giftedness would fall. But it can also refer to state-specific and more or less temporary conditions or modulations of cognition, such as what you will experience in cases of extreme stress. If you've ever been in that kind of situation, you may also be familiar with like certain audio or visual hallucinations that can happen in that kind of state. Now, just as a sidebar here, here's the thing. You can create a name for any condition. You can create a list of criteria that allow us to use that name then in a standardized way. And then we can actually create a label for any experience or set of experiences at all in this manner. We can group sets of experiences together and call this a condition when they all seem to reliably co-occur. You can see how this is like a logical operation. It can go on and on ad infinitum. Now, obviously not to invalidate that process. It's a cornerstone of scientific method, but we can also lose a lot of time and a lot of life in the pursuit of certain labels. And it's almost, in some cases, it's a little bit of an addiction, like the need to have a certain kind of label. And it's really like a labyrinth of labels. And I know like in my late teens, for example, I probably spent 2 years like just deep diving into all of these, like Myers-Briggs, like Enneagram, like on and on and on. And of course, the reason we do this is because they can give us a sense of identity where maybe we haven't had that modeled for us, and that's very important. But the identity or these labels and constructs also work to give us through or by proxy a sense of validation, a sense of belonging. And now here though, this is where we make our way back to the idea of giftedness, because it's quite fascinating that many or even most people who would recognize themselves within the constellation of traits that fit with giftedness often come to like implicitly reject or deny that label. This is on top of just the intrinsic feelings we may have about the label itself, like it sounds elitist and all of this sort of thing, but that's an aside. So many gifted people just openly or implicitly reject the label, or they shy away from it. They don't want to claim the sense of having gifts, or they just seem to like outgrow it and move on altogether. I mean, that's kind of what I did until a few years ago when I ran back into these contexts of neurocomplexity and I realized that it was linked. It was like a distinct phenomenon in this paradigm. So, but let's question why this is, right? Like this kind of tendency among highly gifted people to kind of maybe shy away from that label or not use it. And again, I think this goes beyond just the nature of the label itself. Like, could there be better words for this? Sure. But let's just take a look at the high numbers that we see, for example, in ADHD and autistic communities, right? There's quite a bit, there's a lot. And conversely, like nowhere near do you see that amount for like gifted community, as an example. There's way less of a sense of like shared identity, I guess I'm trying to say, in gifted people. And right there, that is clue number one. So what I'm going to do now is shift over more into looking closer at giftedness and to share my own understanding based on my own experience and research of what's really going on here, and for you, how you can better understand yourself through this framework and whether this applies and how much this applies to you. In classical definition, giftedness is really the best name we have so far for an objective set of cognitive traits or a cognitive disposition that affects a small subset of the general population. Now, this specific idea of giftedness has historical roots. It stems from frameworks and methods in educational psychology, which initially were very much rooted in and focused on identifying and developing this giftedness in children, school children. But right away, there's two important caveats here. First, giftedness doesn't just disappear like once people start going to college. So giftedness in adults has historically and long gone severely underaddressed. I've written a little bit about why I think this is. So if this sounds like you and you're interested, do check out some more of the information and resources that I've put together. This will be linked in the first link below in the description box, and you can get more on this there. Now, the second caveat is that historically, this is also a fairly incomplete idea of giftedness. It's an incomplete understanding and an incomplete assessment of the nature of giftedness more broadly. It is it's a broader and a much deeper phenomenon than merely having high intellectual or creative abilities. So the first point here is that, and this is where I begin to personally diverge from like the more narrow classical conception of giftedness. And this is the part that I've been developing with following my own research and like deep diving in through my own experiences. There is an intrinsic link between having creative gifts, so to speak, and the development of spiritual gifts. Now, the second way in which giftedness in this larger sense really goes underaddressed is that link and the fact that this giftedness really exists in everyone as a potential to be developed. Now, obviously, there are many factors that can get in the way of this, all kinds of childhood trauma and ongoing financial or social resource constraints. But everyone does have this inherent potential that they are here to develop in a way that can make an impact and a helpful contribution that can serve a wider audience, a wider community. So, for example, if you were already like highly skilled in something by age like 3 or 4, that's not a random quirk. And also, like, if it's just completely energetically effortless for you to like read 4 books a week, that is also not a random quirk. That's a clue into one of your unique gifts, because this is by no means widespread in any population, I would say. And it's really something unique to you that you can use to then make a wider or deeper contribution. You are meant to engage those types of gifts. So it may not be exactly that, like it may need to be shaped or further developed. But the point is that the clue is that is your starting point, or one of them, because maybe you have multiple gifts, which often happens. Now, again, if you'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the nature of your own gifts, the types of gifts you have, do use that first link below in the description box. And I've just put together a bunch of resources that you can start accessing to really like help you through this identification and self-assessment process. But now let me try to really just quickly give an overview of my own redefinition, let's say, or reframing of this idea of giftedness within my own framework, which is a larger spiritual context. And I believe it's more integrated and takes into consideration more of the phenomena. And this framework actually acknowledges that the activation and development of your gifts is already setting you on a path of spiritual awakening or spiritual development, whether or not you've seen that yet or recognize it as such. So, giftedness within this context that I'm using really refers more to the activation and awakening of your own gifts. And it often starts out with 3 cognitive traits that establish what I would call like cognitive sovereignty. That's where it starts. With these 3 traits, they tend to be, for example, the fact that we perceive complexity, making finer distinctions, discerning nuance, actively seeking complexity, the more complex aspects of the pursuit of truth. And related to this, it's a more a deeper form of thinking deeply and thinking in depth and divergently. So not merely just relying on baby logic, but this is an active process of questioning, examining contradictions, creating new forms of synthesis, and importantly also the use of the imagination, like I would call it imagining radically. So here we are also engaging the intuition. The imagination is already strongly developed. And this is the aspect that can allow us to, in younger years, we would like skip steps or skip grades or find just absolutely new connections that others haven't been able to recognize yet. Or just more generally, it can present as like just being ahead of the curve on a particular conversation or so-called trend. And then you see like 2 or 5 or 10 years later, then everybody else is kind of there. So that's kind of like a characteristic of where it all starts, this type of cognitive sovereignty. But it eventually matures from that into a path of what I would just call authentic individuation. So individuation in a classic sense is intrinsically authentic anyway, but I just emphasize it here because of the value that gifted people place. It tends to be a core value, authenticity. The value placed on authentic self-knowledge and authentic action, it's very high. And so these individuals will have like a deep need to find aligned work, which is different from just like, liking what you work or like having a passion. Like it's a deeper form of integration where it really needs to feel like this is making sense on a higher level for the kind of contribution I want to make based on how I authentically understand myself and my gifts. And it's really from there or within that process that the links begin to appear between our creative gifts, like a lot of the gifts that we came into this life with or developed easily in childhood, and the higher spiritual gifts that we're really meant to activate later on. As more of these connections begin to come online, so to speak, we this may happen as we begin to receive more guidance, more spiritual direction, let's say, about our higher path, our higher calling, or expressed through our newfound sense of a deeper need to serve on a more impactful level, maybe, than what we had been doing in, like, when we were young adults, in our 20s, 30s. And as we receive more of this higher guidance, we may find that we need to change path or something. We begin to really question the path that we had been on up to this point, which may have reflected more of our this more of this creative register of gifts that we already came in with. And so that is my really quick, brief overview of this process of identifying and developing our gifts. So for me, again, it's very much rooted in a deeper psychospiritual force of development. And I've written about this, like I've documented this. I've got the receipts on my Medium if you've read some of my earlier Medium articles. Now, the awakening of these spiritual gifts can also initiate a dark night of the soul. So it can also seem to inaugurate a lot of chaos in your life because now you are making a transition into new forms of integration. This process of integration itself is a separate topic, which I should talk about specifically. But basically, like, a lot of things need to break down in this process of reorganizing to a higher level. Now, this is really actually a big responsibility. Like, this is a huge task. And we don't really have any social resources or frameworks for, like, really helping with this in the integrated way that it actually demands. We've got resources for looking at, like, one aspect of it, but these are not integrated. And they're often definitely not, like, neurocomplexity informed or with the scope, again, that all of this really requires. So I just feel like that it's part of my contribution to bring these contexts together, specifically for other gifted adults or late identified or gifted adults who definitely also feel this as an aspect of their own spiritual awakening, because this is a very integrated view of giftedness. It's not just about, this is way beyond like, oh, I have a high IQ. Again, if this is you, if this really resonates with you, you can reach out to me for individual private coaching. I'll put that link in the description also. And yeah, like, let me know if this has helped you in any way, if this clarifies anything for you, or if you have any other questions, just drop these in the comments below. I will read them all. I will respond. And yeah, I do invite you to watch some of my other videos on the topic. I'm going to link some of them up here on the screen. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope this has helped.